February 26, 1945. A snow-dusted road outside Elsdorf, Germany, 12 miles west of Cologne. First Lieutenant John Grimball of the 3rd Armoured Division's 32nd Armoured Regiment sat in the turret of his M26 Pershing tank, scanning the rubble-strewn street ahead through his periscope. The Pershing was so new that its operational manual had been mimeographed and distributed just 3 weeks earlier. Grimball's crew had received exactly 4 days of training on the vehicle before it was loaded onto a rail car and shipped to the front. The radio crackled. Contact, Tiger. 800 yards, hull down behind the church ruins. Grimball's gunner, Corporal Clarence Smoyer, had already spotted it, the massive grey shape of a Panzerkampfwagen VI OSF. B. King Tiger, the most heavily armoured operational tank in the world. Its frontal armour measured 7 1/10 inches thick, sloped at 50 degrees. American tankers had been taught that nothing in the Allied arsenal could penetrate a King Tiger from the front at combat ranges. Smoyer traversed the turret. The Pershing's 90mm gun, the longest and most powerful gun ever mounted on an American tank, moved with hydraulic precision. But the question that had haunted American armoured forces since Normandy remained unanswered in actual combat. Could the Pershing's gun, firing the new hypervelocity armour-piercing ammunition, defeat German heavy armour at range? The Germans fired first. The 88mm round from the King Tiger's WWII, 43 litres, 71 gun struck the building beside Grimball's Pershing, showering the tank with brick fragments. Smoyer had the German tank centred in his sight picture. "Identified," Smoyer said, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "Fire," Grimball ordered. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The 90mm gun recoiled. The hypervelocity armour-piercing round, propelled by its tungsten carbide core and special powder charge, left the barrel at 3,350 feet per second, 50% faster than standard armour-piercing ammunition. The round crossed 800 yards in less than 1 second. It struck the King Tiger's frontal turret armour and penetrated. The German tank did not explode in the cinematic fashion of Hollywood productions. There was no fireball. The crew simply abandoned the vehicle within seconds, smoke beginning to pour from the turret hatches. The King Tiger, previously considered immune to frontal penetration by American tanks, had been defeated by a weapon system so new that most American tankers did not yet know it existed. This moment represented the resolution of a problem that had cost thousands of American lives and had nearly broken the confidence of the United States armoured forces in Europe. For 2 years, American tankers had fought German heavy armour with inadequate weapons, relying on manoeuvre, numerical superiority, and desperate courage to overcome a profound technological disadvantage. The Sherman tank, which equipped 95% of American armoured units, could not penetrate a Tiger or Panther frontally at any practical combat range. American doctrine had compensated for this weakness by emphasizing speed and numbers. 5 Shermans to kill 1 Tiger, accepting that 3 or 4 Shermans would burn in the process. The Pershing changed that calculation completely, but it arrived so late in the war, in such small numbers, and with so little preparation, that its impact on the final campaigns in Germany would be limited not by its capabilities, but by the simple fact that there were never more than 20 Pershings in combat at any given time during the final 3 months of the European War. The story of the Pershing is not a story of American technological triumph arriving in time to turn the tide of battle. It is a story of a weapon system that arrived after the tide had already turned, proof that the United States had finally learned lessons that should have been learned in 1943, delivered to tankers who had already won the war without it. The doctrinal foundation for American tank development in World War II rested on a fundamental misunderstanding of armoured warfare that would cost thousands of lives before it was corrected. In 1940, when the United States Army began serious planning for armoured force expansion, the prevailing doctrine separated tanks into 2 categories: infantry support tanks and cavalry tanks. The infantry support role called for a medium tank with adequate armour to resist small arms and light anti-tank weapons, sufficient armament to destroy machine gun nests and fortifications, and the mechanical reliability to advance with infantry across varied terrain. The cavalry role called for fast, lightly armoured tanks whose primary mission was reconnaissance and exploitation of breakthroughs, not engagement with enemy armour. Tank destroyer battalions, equipped with high-velocity guns mounted on lighter chassis, would handle enemy tanks. This doctrine assumed that tank versus tank combat would be rare, and that specialized vehicles, not main battle tanks, would counter enemy armor. This assumption was wrong. The Germans had learned different lessons from their campaigns in Poland, France, and Russia. German doctrine emphasized the tank's role as the primary instrument of breakthrough and exploitation, supported by infantry and artillery rather than supporting them. More importantly, German tanks were designed to fight other tanks as their primary mission. The Panzer IV, upgraded repeatedly throughout the war, received progressively longer 75mm guns, specifically to defeat enemy armor at increasing ranges. The Tiger I, introduced in 1942, mounted an 88mm gun derived from the famous Flak 36 anti-aircraft gun, capable of destroying any Allied tank at ranges exceeding 2,000 yards. The Panther, introduced in 1943 after German encounters with Soviet T-34 tanks, combined the sloped armor principles learned from the T-34 with a long 75mm high-velocity gun that could penetrate 4 7/10 inches of armor at 1,000 yards. American tankers first encountered German heavy armor in significant numbers during the Normandy campaign in June 1944. The Sherman tank, which equipped American armored divisions, mounted a 75mm gun that could not penetrate a Panther's frontal armor at any range and could not penetrate a Tiger's frontal armor beyond 300 yards, assuming ideal 90-degree impact angles that rarely occurred in combat. The Sherman's own armor, 2 1/3 inches at the front and 1 1/2 inches on the sides, could be penetrated by German tank guns at ranges exceeding 1 mile. The psychological impact on American tank crews was severe. Lieutenant Belton Cooper, maintenance officer for the 3rd Armored Division, documented the losses in his post-war memoir. During the 6 months from D-Day to the end of 1944, the 3rd Armored Division alone lost more than 1,000 Sherman tanks to all causes. Approximately 250 of those losses were complete write-offs, tanks burned so thoroughly that nothing remained salvageable. Cooper calculated that the average life expectancy of a Sherman tank in combat operations during the Normandy campaign was 17 days. Crew casualties were correspondingly severe. A Sherman tank carried a crew of 5, commander, gunner, loader, driver, and assistant driver, bow gunner. When a Sherman was penetrated by a German anti-tank round, the likelihood of fire was approximately 70% due to the tank's gasoline engine and ammunition storage configuration. Crew survival rates varied by position, with the commander and loader, who had turret hatches directly above them, having the highest survival rates. The driver and assistant driver, seated in the hull with a single shared hatch, had significantly lower survival rates. The average Sherman crew that completed a full combat tour from Normandy to Germany would serve in 3 or 4 different tanks as previous vehicles were destroyed. American tankers developed their own tactical responses to the disparity in armor and firepower. The standard method for engaging a Tiger or Panther involved using terrain and maneuver to attack from the flanks or rear, where German armor was thinner. Multiple Shermans would coordinate their movements, with some tanks drawing German fire, while others maneuvered for side shots. This worked, but it required numerical superiority, good radio communication, favorable terrain, and acceptance of casualties. It also required exceptional courage from crews who knew they were driving vehicles that could not protect them in frontal engagements with German heavy tanks. The crisis of American tank inferiority reached its apex during the Battle of the Bulge, Germany's last major offensive on the Western Front, launched on December 16, 1944, through the Ardennes forest. German forces committed significant numbers of Tiger and Panther tanks to the offensive, and American armored units faced them in weather conditions that negated Allied air superiority. The results confirmed what tankers already knew. The Sherman tank was inadequate for sustained combat against German heavy armor. At the village of Krinkelt-Rocherath, the 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions, supported by elements of the 2nd and 9th Armoured Divisions, fought a desperate defensive action against the 1st SS Panzer Division and the 12th SS Panzer Division, American tank destroyers, primarily M10 Wolverines mounting 3-inch guns and M36 Jacksons, mounting 90mm guns, achieved some success against German armour, but they were lightly armoured themselves and vulnerable to any return fire. Sherman tanks engaged German Panthers and Tigers in close-range street fighting, where their mobility and numerical superiority could partially compensate for their disadvantage in armour and firepower. The fighting at Krinkelt-Rocherath demonstrated both the courage of American tank crews and the severe limitations of their equipment. Staff Sergeant Donald Critchfield of the 741st Tank Battalion engaged a Panther tank at approximately 200 yards in the streets of Krinkelt. His 75mm gun could not penetrate the Panther's frontal armour even at that close range. Critchfield manoeuvred his Sherman to get a side shot, fired, and achieved a hit that disabled the Panther's tracks. The German tank could not move, but its gun remained operational. Critchfield's Sherman was hit twice while withdrawing, killing his driver and wounding his assistant driver. Critchfield survived and continued fighting in another tank the following day. This pattern repeated across the Bulge battlefield. American tanks achieved victories through manoeuvre, aggression, and acceptance of casualties, not through superiority in individual combat capability. The after-action reports from American armoured units during the Battle of the Bulge repeatedly recommended immediate deployment of heavier tanks with more powerful guns. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commanding the 37th Tank Battalion of the 4th Armoured Division, submitted a report to 3rd Army Headquarters in early January 1945, stating explicitly that the Sherman tank was obsolete and that American tank crews deserved better equipment. The problem was not that the United States lacked the industrial capacity or technical knowledge to build heavier tanks. American industry had produced over 49,000 Sherman tanks by the end of 1944, a production achievement unmatched by any other nation. American engineers understood the principles of armour, design, and gun performance. The Ordnance Department had tested heavy tank prototypes as early as 1942. The T-26 heavy tank, which would eventually become the M26 Pershing, had been in development since 1943. The problem was institutional resistance to changing a system that, despite its human cost, was winning the war. General Leslie McNair, commanding Army Ground Forces until his death in Normandy in July 1944, had opposed heavy tank development throughout the war. McNair believed that specialized tank destroyers should handle enemy armor while medium tanks supported infantry. General George Patton, perhaps America's most famous armored commander, also initially opposed heavy tank development, arguing that the Sherman's reliability and mobility were more valuable than heavier armor and bigger guns. The Army Service Forces, responsible for shipping equipment to Europe, opposed heavy tanks because they were more difficult to transport and maintain than Shermans. This institutional resistance began to crack under the weight of casualty reports and the demands of frontline commanders. In January 1945, General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe, personally requested immediate shipment of heavy tanks to the European theatre. The Ordnance Department accelerated production of the T-26, now officially designated the M26 Pershing. The first 20 Pershings arrived in Antwerp, Belgium, on January 25, 1945. They were immediately loaded onto rail cars and shipped to forward areas, arriving at 3rd Armoured Division positions outside Aachen in early February. The tank that American crews had needed since Normandy had finally arrived, 8 months into the campaign in northwest Europe, 3 months before Germany's surrender. The M26 Pershing that arrived in Europe in February 1945 represented the culmination of nearly 3 years of development, testing, and bureaucratic struggle. The tank weighed 46 tons, substantially heavier than the 33-ton Sherman but still lighter than the 69-ton King Tiger or the 57-ton Tiger I. Its Continental R-975 radial engine, the same engine used in the Sherman, produced 500 horsepower, giving the Pershing a power-to-weight ratio of 10.9 horsepower per ton, compared to the Sherman's 15.8. This meant the Pershing was slower and less agile than the Sherman, with a maximum road speed of 25 miles per hour compared to the Sherman's 30 miles per hour. But the Pershing's armament and armor protection represented a fundamental improvement over anything previously fielded by American forces. The tank's frontal armor measured 4 inches thick on the hull, sloped at 46 degrees, providing an effective thickness of approximately 5.7 inches against flat trajectory fire. The turret front was 4 inches thick with better sloping, providing effective protection of approximately 6 inches. Side armor was 3 inches thick on the hull and 3 inches on the turret. This armor configuration made the Pershing immune to frontal penetration by the German 75mm guns mounted on Panzer IVs and comparable to the protection offered by German Panthers, though still inferior to the King Tiger's 7-inch frontal armor. The Pershing's primary weapon, the 90mm gun M3, was derived from the 90mm anti-aircraft gun, but modified for tank use with a different breech mechanism and recoil system. The gun fired several types of ammunition, but the most significant for anti-armor purposes was the 90mm hypervelocity armor-piercing tracer round, designated HVAP or T30E16. This round weighed approximately 11 pounds, with a tungsten, carbide penetrator core weighing approximately 4 pounds, surrounded by a light aluminum ballistic cap. The special powder charge propelled the round at an initial muzzle velocity of 3,350 feet per second, compared to 2,700 feet per second for standard armor-piercing rounds. The HVAP round's performance was extraordinary by the standards of 1945. At 1,000 yards, the round could penetrate approximately 7.1 inches of homogeneous armor plate at a 30-degree impact angle. At 2,000 yards, penetration remained approximately 5.8 inches at 30 degrees. These figures meant that the Pershing, firing HVAP ammunition, could penetrate the frontal armor of any German tank in service at combat ranges, including the King Tiger's turret front and the glacis plate of Panthers and Tiger IS. However, HVAP ammunition was scarce. The tungsten carbide cores required tungsten, a strategic material also needed for machine tool production and other war industries. The United States maintained limited tungsten reserves, supplemented by imports from China and South America, but competition for tungsten between various military and industrial applications meant that HVAP ammunition could not be produced in the quantities needed to supply all American tank and tank destroyer units. Pershings typically carried approximately 10 rounds of HVAP ammunition among their 70 total rounds of 90mm ammunition, with the remainder being standard armor-piercing, high-explosive, and white phosphorus smoke rounds. The crews selected to operate the first Pershings received minimal specialized training. The 3rd Armored Division received its first Pershings in early February 1945 and immediately formed a provisional company of 20 tanks from the division's existing tank crews. These men had been fighting in Shermans since Normandy. They received approximately 4 days of familiarization training with the new tanks before being committed to combat operations around Ardennes and Cologne. The training focused on basic mechanical operation, starting procedures, driving characteristics, turret traverse mechanisms, gun loading procedures, and radio operation. There was no time for gunnery training or tactical exercises. The crews would learn the Pershing's combat capabilities by using them in actual combat. Lieutenant John Grimball's crew in the Pershing, named Fireball, typified this hurried transition. Grimball had commanded Sherman tanks since Normandy and had survived the destruction of 2 previous tanks, once at Mortain in August 1944 and once during the Battle of the Bulge in December. His gunner, Corporal Clarence Smoyer, had been with him since Normandy and was known throughout the battalion as one of the best gunners in the regiment. His loader, Private John DeRiggy, was newer to the crew but had served as a loader in another Sherman for 4 months. The driver, Technician 5th Grade William McVeigh, and the assistant driver, Private James Farney, completed the crew. All 5 men had combat experience. None had fired the 90mm gun before receiving their Pershing. The tank itself was so new that it carried teething problems that would not be resolved during the war. The transmission, adapted from a design intended for lighter vehicles, proved fragile under the Pershing's weight. Final drive failures occurred with disturbing frequency during the first month of operations. The engine, adequate for the Sherman's lighter weight, struggled with the Pershing's mass, particularly in muddy conditions or on steep slopes. Fuel consumption was significantly higher than the Sherman's, reducing operational range. The tracks, wider than Sherman tracks but still not wide enough for the tank's weight, created ground pressure that caused the Pershing to bog down in soft soil more readily than Sherman's. But none of these mechanical problems mattered as much as the question that dominated every discussion among Pershing crews. Could the 90mm gun defeat German heavy armor in actual combat? The ballistic calculations said yes. The test range results said yes. But calculations and test ranges did not account for the chaos of combat, the stress of being fired upon, the difficulty of identifying targets through vision blocks and periscopes, the need to fire quickly before the enemy fired first. American tankers had learned to distrust optimistic promises about equipment performance. They would believe the Pershing could defeat Tigers and Panthers when they saw it happen, not before. The engagement at Elsdorf on February 26, 1945, provided the first confirmed instance of an M26 Pershing defeating a German heavy tank in combat, but it was the engagement at Cologne on March 6 that demonstrated the Pershing's capabilities to a wider audience and established its reputation among American armored forces. Cologne, Germany's fourth largest city, sat on the west bank of the Rhine River. American forces had surrounded the city by early March, but German defenders held the urban core, using the rubble of Allied bombing raids as fortified positions. The 3rd Armoured Division's mission was to clear the city and secure the approaches to the Hohenzollern Bridge, one of the few Rhine crossings still intact. Task Force Wellborn, named for its commander Lieutenant Colonel John Wellborn, spearheaded the assault into the city centre with a combined force of tanks, infantry, and tank destroyers. The Pershing Eagle 7, commanded by Staff Sergeant Robert Early, advanced with Task Force Wellborn into Cologne's inner city on the morning of March 6th. The tank moved slowly through rubble-filled streets, accompanied by infantry who searched buildings for German soldiers and anti-tank weapons. At approximately 1000 hours, Eagle 7 rounded a corner near the Cologne Cathedral and encountered a Panzer IV tank approximately 400 yards distant, positioned hull down behind rubble. The Panzer IV fired first. Its 75mm round struck Eagle 7's frontal armour and ricocheted, leaving a bright scar on the armour plate but failing to penetrate. Early's gunner, Corporal Elmer Lower, returned fire with a 90mm armour-piercing round that struck the Panzer IV's turret and penetrated. The German tank began burning immediately, its crew abandoning the vehicle within seconds. This engagement, while tactically significant, was not particularly remarkable from a technical perspective. The Panzer IV's 75mm gun could not penetrate the Pershing's frontal armour at any reasonable combat range, and the Pershing's 90mm gun could easily defeat the Panzer IV's armour. The engagement simply confirmed what was already known. The Pershing was superior to Germany's older medium tanks. What happened next was remarkable. A Panther tank, which had been concealed in the rubble approximately 600 yards from Eagle 7's position, began moving to get a better firing angle on the American tank. The Panther's long 75mm gun could penetrate the Pershing's frontal armour at 600 yards if the shot was well placed, and the Panther's own sloped frontal armour made it a difficult target even for the Pershing's 90mm gun. Corporal Lower spotted the Panther moving and immediately traversed the turret. The Panther stopped moving, presumably to fire, presenting a stationary target. Lower had time for one carefully aimed shot before the Panther could fire. He had loaded an HVAP round after the engagement with the Panzer IV, following standard procedure to keep the most effective anti-armour round ready when operating in areas where heavy German tanks might be encountered. The sequence of events was recorded by multiple observers, including Lieutenant Grimball, who was commanding another Pershing approximately 200 yards behind Eagle 7, and by combat cameramen from the Army Signal Corps who were filming the advance into Cologne. The film footage, though grainy and shot from a distance, clearly shows the engagement. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Lower fired. The HVAP round struck the Panther's turret front, slightly to the right of the gun mantlet, and penetrated. The Panther did not explode or burn immediately. Instead, it simply stopped moving. Several seconds passed. Then the turret hatches opened, and the crew began evacuating. Smoke began pouring from the turret hatches as the crew abandoned the tank. Within 30 seconds, all 5 crew members had evacuated and were running toward German-held positions deeper in the city. Staff Sergeant Early reported the engagement immediately over the battalion radio net. His report was brief and factual. Eagle 7 engaged and destroyed 1 Panzer IV and 1 Panther. Frontal hits. No damage to Eagle 7. This report was received by every tank commander and infantry officer on the battalion net, including Lieutenant Colonel Wellborn and the officers commanding the other Pershings in Task Force Wellborn. The psychological impact of this engagement exceeded its tactical significance. American tank crews had been fighting Panthers since Normandy, nearly 9 months earlier. Every crew knew that a Sherman could not penetrate a Panther frontally at combat ranges. Defeating a Panther required maneuver, multiple tanks working together, flanking shots, or extremely close-range fire into weak points. It required tactics that accepted casualties as the price of victory. The standard rule among American tankers was that it took 5 Shermans to kill 1 Panther, and 3 or 4 of those Shermans would probably be knocked out in the process. Eagle 7 had defeated a Panther with a single frontal shot at 600 yards, without taking any damage beyond superficial scarring from the Panzer IV's failed penetration attempt. This was not the result of superior tactics or numerical superiority or favorable terrain. It was the result of having a better tank with a better gun, firing better ammunition. The engagement at Cologne was documented not only through radio logs and after-action reports, but also through the Army Signal Corps film footage that captured the moment. The footage was circulated among American armored units in the days following the engagement, serving as both tactical intelligence and morale-building propaganda. Tank crews could see, with their own eyes, that the Pershing could do what Shermans could not: defeat German heavy armor in frontal engagements at combat ranges. Additional engagements in the following days provided further evidence. On March 9th, a Pershing from the 33rd Armored Regiment engaged a Tiger I tank at approximately 900 yards outside the town of Remagen. The Pershing fired 2 HVAP rounds. The first struck the Tiger's turret front and penetrated. The second, fired as the Tiger was attempting to reverse into cover, struck the hull front and also penetrated. The Tiger burned. Its crew evacuated successfully, but the tank was a total loss. On March 11th, near the town of Bonn, a Pershing engaged a King Tiger at approximately 1,200 yards, an extraordinarily long range for tank versus tank combat in the terrain of Western Germany. The Pershing's gunner fired 1 HVAP round that struck the King Tiger's turret front, but failed to penetrate, leaving a deep crater in the armor but not breaking through. The King Tiger returned fire, missing the Pershing. The Pershing fired again, this time aiming for the King Tiger's lower hull where the armor was slightly thinner. The second shot penetrated, disabling the King Tiger's engine. The German crew abandoned the immobilized tank rather than continue fighting from a fixed position. The statistical impact of the Pershing was therefore minimal in the broader context of the war. Of the approximately 40,000 American tanks deployed in Europe during World War II, fewer than 60 were Pershings. Of those 60, only about 32 saw actual combat, and of those 32, only about 20 participated in engagements against German armor. The Pershing accounted for perhaps 30 to 40 confirmed German tank kills during the final 3 months of the war, an insignificant fraction of total German tank losses in the same period. But the psychological impact on the crews who operated Pershings was profound. For the first time, American tankers had equipment that matched or exceeded German capabilities. They no longer needed to rely solely on numerical superiority, tactical ingenuity, and acceptance of casualties. They could fight German heavy tanks on equal terms, trusting their armor to protect them and their gun to penetrate enemy armor. The Pershing validated what American tankers had been requesting since Normandy: a tank designed to fight other tanks, not merely to support infantry. Lieutenant John Grimball, who commanded a Pershing from February through the end of the war in May, wrote in a letter to his family in April 1945, "The new tank changes everything. We no longer feel like we are going into battle with inadequate equipment. The boys have confidence in the machine and in themselves. We can fight the Germans on even terms now. I only wish we had received these tanks a year ago. We would have saved a lot of good men." The story of the M26 Pershing is not ultimately a story about tanks. It is a story about institutional decision-making, about the gap between what is technically possible and what is organizationally acceptable, about the human cost of choosing industrial efficiency over combat effectiveness. The Pershing arrived too late to change the outcome of World War II, but it arrived in time to prove that American tankers had fought for 2 years with equipment their own country knew was inadequate. The mathematics were never in dispute. German tank guns could penetrate American tank armor at ranges where American guns could not penetrate German armor. This was not a matter of opinion or tactical doctrine. It was physics. The Ordnance Department knew it. The Army Ground Forces knew it. The theater commanders knew it. Most importantly, the tank crews knew it. They knew it every time they saw a Sherman burn after being hit by a Panther. They knew it every time they maneuvered 5 tanks to kill 1 Tiger, losing 3 tanks in the process. They knew it every time they loaded their dead and wounded into ambulances after an engagement. The argument against producing heavy tanks earlier was never technical. The United States possessed the industrial capacity to produce Pershings in 1943 if the decision had been made to do so. The argument was institutional. Heavy tanks were harder to ship, harder to maintain, consumed more fuel, and required more training. These were real concerns, but they were logistical concerns, and logistics exists to support combat effectiveness, not to constrain it. General George Marshall, Army Chief of Staff throughout World War II, addressed this issue in his biennial report to the Secretary of War, published in 1945. Marshall wrote, "The decision to standardize on the M4 medium tank was correct when made in 1942. The failure to modify that decision in 1943, when the limitations of the M4 became apparent in combat, represents a failure of institutional responsiveness. We learned this lesson at great cost. We must ensure we do not learn it again." The Pershing's combat record in the final months of World War II, impressive though it was, cannot erase the record of the 2 years that preceded it. The 37 German tanks destroyed by Pershings in 3 months must be weighed against the thousands of German tanks destroyed by Shermans in 2 years, and against the thousands of American tankers who died in those Shermans because their tanks could not protect them. On May 8, 1945, when Germany surrendered, approximately 53 Pershings were in Europe. Approximately 20,000 Shermans were in Europe. The Shermans had won the war. The Pershings had proven what could have been done differently. This distinction matters. It matters to the families of the men who died in inadequate equipment. It matters to the historical record. It matters to future generations of soldiers who will trust that their country will equip them properly for the wars they are asked to fight. The sign that Major General Jimmy Doolittle ordered changed in January 1944, redirecting fighter doctrine from defensive escort to offensive destruction of enemy fighters, represented institutional courage, the willingness to change doctrine when evidence demanded it. The delay in deploying the Pershing until February 1945 represented the opposite, institutional inertia that valued procedural correctness over combat effectiveness. Both decisions affected outcomes. Doolittle's decision to change fighter tactics in January 1944 helped win air supremacy over Europe by June. The decision to delay heavy tank production until late 1944 meant that American tankers fought without adequate equipment through Normandy, through France, through Belgium, and into Germany. They won anyway, through courage and sacrifice and acceptance of casualties that better equipment would have reduced. The final lesson of the Pershing is not about tanks. It is about the responsibility institutions bear to the individuals they send into combat. The United States had the technical knowledge, industrial capacity, and material resources to produce a tank equal to German heavy armor in 1943. The decision not to do so until 1945 was not inevitable. It was a choice, That choice had consequences measured in burning Shermans and dead tank crews and families who received telegrams informing them that their sons and husbands had been killed in action. Lieutenant John Grimball's Pershing Fireball survived the war intact and was eventually shipped back to the United States, where it was used as a training vehicle at Fort Knox, Kentucky, until 1953. The tank no longer exists. It was scrapped as part of a depot modernization program. But the combat footage of Fireball engaging the King Tiger at Elsdorf still exists, archived in the National Archives in College Park, Maryland. The footage shows what American industry could produce when asked. The date the footage was shot, February 26, 1945, shows when American institutions finally asked. The story of the M26 Pershing begins on February 26, 1945, with a 90mm HVAP round penetrating a King Tiger's turret at 800 yards. But the real story begins 2 years earlier, when American tankers first encountered German heavy armor in North Africa and Italy and reported that their equipment was inadequate. The Pershing was the answer to that report, delivered too late to matter strategically, but in time to prove the report had been correct all along. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.